Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Angelo Falcone. I'm a doctor of integrative medicine outside the Washington, D.C. area. And this is a version of a talk that I give to both business groups and community groups across the country, really focused on longevity. How do you keep yourself as healthy as long as possible? So we'll talk a little bit about what are the drivers of personal health and how you actually have a lot of control over your own health. So how should you think about this? So I'd like you to think about this as think of yourself being in your mid-50s. I'm 58 years old. And if you've made it into your mid-50s, there's a pretty good likelihood that you're going to make it into your mid-80s, just from a statistical standpoint. So think about that and think about what those next 30 years of your life will look like. And if you're younger, you could think about the next 40 or 50 years of your life. So what my question to you is, do you think you have another 30 years left in you? Are you living the kind of life today that you want to live 30 years from now? And it's an important question, and questions that we don't often ask ourselves. So I think you have to have a mental image of what you want those next 30 years to look like. And this is my mental image of those next 30 years. I love to ski. I grew up skiing in northeastern Pennsylvania, a small mountain called Elk Mountain, and I really enjoy it. I love going out west. I actually take my son out west every year, and we go out and we enjoy his spring break in Park City. So he learned to ski and first learned how to ski in Park City. I learned how to ski in northeastern Pennsylvania. So we try and give our kids a little bit more than we have. But I want you to have that mental image of what that next 30 years is going to look like to you as we have this conversation and you listen to the things that I'm telling you. So let me tell you a little bit about me. I have been a physician for almost 30 years. I was trained as an emergency physician at Georgetown and George Washington University hospitals. I practiced in all kinds of settings, in both large hospitals, community hospitals, academic institutions, rural hospitals, trauma centers, non-trauma centers. And I did that for 25 years. I saw tens of thousands of people directly at the bedside. And I was really good at what I did. I enjoyed doing what I did for many, many years. I actually was also part of a founding group of physicians that started a practice outside the DC area, grew that practice to be fairly sizable, taking care of about 500,000 patients a year, and then became part of the largest physician partnership in the acute care space called the U.S. Acute Care Solutions in 2016. And I became a founding member on the board of directors. I still sit on the board of directors of that company. We see almost 10 million patients a year now, which is just a staggering number. And I have the privilege of seeing a lot of great leaders and a lot of great people. So I have this really interesting history of being a physician. And directly taking care of thousands of patients, and also this business person who is responsible for growing a group with all its intended challenges of any business. And I kind of have enjoyed both of that throughout my career. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of health span versus lifespan. Health span is probably not a term that you may have heard about. Health span is how long you live your most functional life free of disease. And lifespan is quite simply how long you live. So we all know 70-year-olds that are out there playing tennis on the golf course. And unfortunately, we also know 70-year-olds that are in nursing homes that are not communicative with their families. And, our vision of ourselves, of course, is that we want to be that in that former group and not in that latter group. And that's really what we're going to be talking about over the next hour and a half to 2 hours. So I wanted to get a slide that kind of sums up healthcare in America. And I think this is a really good way of phrasing it. If you have a problem, we got a pill. If you have high blood pressure, we have antihypertensives. If you have depression, we have SSRIs. If you have high cholesterol, we have statins and other drugs. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the issue is, how are we doing as far as that type of healthcare system? And I'm going to show you some data a little bit later that really questions whether we're getting the best outcomes really with a pharmacological-based approach to treatment strategy, which is kind of what we have in the United States, certainly. So, should we think about integrative health and exactly what it is? Well, integrative health really combines three specific areas. The first one is what we can call conventional medicine. You think about yourself going to your primary care physician. He or she may be seeing you for a routine physical exam. Maybe you have an illness that you're going in for an evaluation or an injury. They'll evaluate you. They'll determine if you need any medications, maybe a referral to a physical therapist. And if you have a serious condition like ongoing chest pain or gastrointestinal issues, they're going to refer you to a specialist, cardiologist, gastroenterologist, rheumatologist. Depending on what ologist you need, they're going to refer you to the appropriate specialist. And that's kind of how we think about healthcare in America. And then there's this whole area of lifestyle and self-care, which is part of the bubble that's hidden by my lovely image. Lifestyle and self-care are all the things that you can do that really dramatically impact your health. So two of the most common things that people have done and has grown tremendously over the last couple of decades are meditative practices and yoga. And those both have significant mental health benefits as well as general physical health benefits. And you can see over the last 20 years the dramatic growth in those two particular areas as an example of things that you can do yourself. You don't need a doctor's note. You don't need a prescription to do it. You just need to find a good practitioner or a good YouTube video that you can learn some of these techniques to really keep yourself healthy. I like to say that 99% of healthcare is outside the doctor's office. And that is true. It's all the things that we do outside of our doctor's office that makes us healthy and certainly impacts our longevity. And then there's this third area called complementary and alternative healthcare. There's an actual center in the NIH called the Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. It used to be called the Alternative Healthcare, then it became complementary, and now it's integrative. So let me give you an example of that. So let's think about traditional Chinese medicine, right? Traditional Chinese medicine practitioners are doctors. They've been trained in a particular way of caring for patients, specifically around energy and the qi that flows through our body, and how the disruption of that energy throughout your body is really what causes disease. And traditional Chinese medicine believes that rebalancing your body either through traditional Chinese herbs, through acupuncture, a combination of those, is what you need to achieve health. So most of us don't go to a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, right? But if you think about it, for like 1.4 billion Chinese people, it's not an alternative healthcare system. It's just medicine. That's how they care for their population. And I think that there's some statistics that show, as we kind of go head to head, that there may be something for us to learn from these other types of practitioners that practice in a different way. And there's many, many different ones. There are medical yoga therapists, there are medical massage therapists, of course, chiropractors, very common that many people go to. There are Reiki specialists, which is a specific belief in a biofield around your body. And there's an energy force around our body, and Reiki specialists have the ability to kind of shape that energy. For some of us, that may sound like a really crazy idea, but there's actually been studies done comparing people that underwent Reiki, which is non-therapeutic touch, before a surgical procedure, specifically cardiac procedures. And they looked at the typical things that we look at in healthcare. We looked at how long you stayed in the hospital, how much pain medication you required, were there any complications. And they found that the people that underwent Reiki before their procedure, again, non-therapeutic touch, actually had shorter lengths of stays, less need for pain medication, and less complications. So while we don't specifically fully understand exactly that whole biofield area, clearly there's something there. So just a way to think about healthcare and integrative care in these three specific facets. So why did I get interested in it? I was an emergency physician for 25 years. I was growing a group. I was very deep involved in the business and loved it. I loved what I did. But I started to see the same patients over and over and over again. And I started to think, like, is there a better way for us to take care of patients? Is there something that we could do that maybe prevents some of the diseases that I'm now having to treat and my colleagues are now having to treat in the emergency department? So I started getting interested in data and statistics and how are we doing and how do we compare to other healthcare systems. So this is a graph that from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. They look at the top 37 or 38 industrialized countries in the world, and they kind of rank them. They rank them on economic factors, gross domestic product. They rank them on longevity factors, on healthcare factors, and they kind of compare country to country, kind of where you line up. So this graph is specific to looking at the per person cost per year of healthcare. And as you can see in the middle, that kind of red line, it's about $4,000. This was in 2019, I believe, 2020 maybe, $4,000 per person per year that was spent across the world on average in these countries that were evaluated. And you, of course, can see us on the far left in the United States. We spend over $10,000 per person per year. And again, this is a couple years old, so you can only imagine that those numbers have gone up. And the question isn't that we spend twice as much as the average industrialized country. The question is, do we get twice as much for what we're spending? And the answer, I think, is no. Let's look at some simple statistics. How about longevity? How long you live? Probably the simplest thing. Do we have the longest life expectancy of any country out there? No. We're in the bottom half of that graph as far as life expectancy. Well, how about maternal death rates? Women who are giving birth that die in childbirth. We're actually in the bottom third of that. How about deaths in the first 30 days of life? Neonatal deaths. How are we doing with that one? Bottom half of the graph. So one of the things that I hear or that you may be thinking is, well, America is a very socioeconomically diverse country. We don't have universal health care, which is an entirely other issue. We have people that are haves and have-nots. So that's what really explains it, right? Well, it's interesting because when they actually broke the data up into the higher socioeconomic groups in the particular countries and compared that to how we do for healthcare, we're still worse. So think about that for a minute. We're spending twice as much as any other country, and we're getting worse outcomes. So that was one thing that really got me interested in, like, how can we do things differently? And the next thing that got me interested was this lovely woman here. This is my wife, Amy. This is going to a Pink concert. If you ever have an opportunity to go to a Pink concert, I would highly recommend it. I was not a Pink fan. I liked her music, but, went to see her in concert. Absolutely fabulous performer. Go see her if you have a chance. So Amy and I got married about 14 years ago. We're a yours, mine, and ours household. And we have Chance, who's our 12-and-a-half-year-old now, as I'm recording this. Almost 13, actually. He's almost a teenager. He is the last of the Mohicans. So Amy got pregnant at 44. And she had a very difficult pregnancy. She was hospitalized several times. She had gestational diabetes. She had to go on insulin. And after she delivered, thankfully Chance was healthy. She just didn't feel right. And this went on for weeks and starting to go into months. And she said, there's just something wrong here. I just don't feel right. So I said, well, this was 14 years ago or 13 years ago. I said, well, go see your doctor. I knew doctors. I knew good doctors, and she was seeing a couple of them. So she went to see her primary care physician, went to see her OBGYN, who is a woman, which is important for the latter part of this conversation. And they did some blood tests. Nothing really came back. And then she heard from her OB everything that a 44-year-old woman wants to hear. You're a little bit older. Just give it a little bit more time. Things will be okay. And Amy said, you know what? There's something wrong here. There's just something different going on here. So she said, I'm going to go see a nutritionist I heard about. And this was, again, almost 13 years ago. I was like, okay. I said, don't know much about nutritionists. I said, well, go see one. Good luck. And after about an hour conversation, the nutritionist, no testing, no blood work, nothing like that. kind of looked at our conversation and said, "I think you may be celiac." To which my wife replied, I won't give you the exact quote because we're recording this, "I think you're full of crap because I grew up on a wheat farm." And that is actually a true statement. She grew up on a wheat farm in Ohio. Her family still farms the land there. And she was exposed to wheat all the time. As most of you may or may not know, celiac disease is a sensitivity, actually an immune reaction to gluten, which is the protein in wheat. So the nutritionist said, "Humor me. Why don't you go gluten-free for the next 6 weeks? Just see what happens." Within a couple of weeks, her joint pain, her fatigue, her brain fog was getting better. Within 4 to 6 weeks, everything was gone. And that was just really eye-opening to me, in the sense that she went to see really good doctors. She got the typical testing done, and it was kind of just passed off. And she went to see a nutritionist who made a diagnosis in an hour of just talking with her. And that taught me that maybe we should widen our lens of who we think about regarding healthcare and who can help us become healthier. So this conversation is really going to revolve around 3 areas. It's going to be about the food we put in our body, how we treat our body, and how we keep our mind as sharp as possible. And it's really focused on what I call the 4 pillars of nutrition, movement, sleep, and the last one, which is partially covered, mental resiliency. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about mental resiliency. So how you keep your mind as sharp as long as possible. So mental resiliency really revolves around 4 specific areas. And these are areas I talk to my patients about all the time. I mean, I have a private practice. I see patients for various conditions. And we talk about these 4 areas and really in a structured approach. So for mental resiliency, these are the 4 specific components of it. The first one is mindfulness. Mindfulness is the whole concept of how you can calm yourself, right? It's this balance of this sympathetic and parasympathetic system in our body. Sympathetic system being your fight or flight. Think about someone cutting you off in traffic and your blood pressure goes up, you get tense, your heart rate goes up, your cortisol gets spiked, adrenaline goes up. That's your sympathetic fight or flight reflexes. And the balance to that is your parasympathetic, your rest and relaxation. Lower heart rate, lower cortisol levels, lower blood pressure. Really mediated by what's called the vagus nerve, longest nerve in the body, starts at the base of your brain, goes through your chest, and innervates most of your intestinal tract. So this whole concept of the brain-gut connection, we think is really part of it mediated by the vagus nerve. It's a two-way connection between your brain and your gut, and actually communication goes both ways. So mindfulness, and there's different ways and different techniques considered mindfulness techniques. I've already mentioned one, which is meditation, things like breath work, things like gratitude practices, journaling, walking in nature. These would all be considered mindfulness practices. You can actually measure the effectiveness of your mindfulness practice, and it's called heart rate variability, or HRV. Anybody that's wearing a device, and I'm wearing a Garmin, and I usually wear an Oura Ring, they can actually measure heart rate variability. So exactly what is HRV? HRV is normally you have what's called normal sinus rhythm. That's your heartbeat. It's boom, 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 boom. Okay, that's normal sinus rhythm, no irregular beats. While those sound exactly the same, there is a difference between each beat, and it can be measured in milliseconds. And HRV, heart rate variability, actually measures that variance between the beats of your heart. The higher your heart rate variability, actually the healthier you are. And we know that mindfulness techniques like meditation, like breath work, like yoga, can actually increase HRV. And it's been shown that people with higher HRV have less cardiovascular deaths, and this is long-term, longer down the line. So it's a really important thing, and you can actually physically measure it. So what is a next component of mindfulness? Next component is what's called constantly learning. Not as important or pertinent while we're in the workforce, because we're typically working really hard. Either you're raising kids or you're in the office and you're constantly challenging yourself, right? Once we start to retire, that's actually a danger time that we have to think about intentionally about how do we continue to constantly learn. So what are the ways that we can do that? Well, there's a couple ways that have actually been studied. One is playing an instrument, so it's never too late to learn the guitar. Another one is learning a new language. Another area that would actually help in the constantly learning area is high physical fitness. So if there's a lot of data about physical fitness and brain health, and there's other things that you can do. What you want to try and do is give your brain as much positive energy and positive challenge as you can to keep those connections forming and reforming. It's called neuroplasticity. You can actually do it throughout your life. There used to be this thought that you stop developing new neural connections, in your 40s or 50s. You can actually continue to develop them long into the future. You just have to work at it. So that's the second component of mental resiliency. The third is strengthening the tribe. What do I mean by that? Well, most of us have a group of people that we've traveled through life with, either family or friends that support you when you're having trouble, and conversely, when someone's having a tough time, you're there to support them. And this concept of community certainly has become very important in the last several years as we've gone through COVID. But this concept of continuing to maintain and nurture that tribe as we age becomes very, very important. And speaking directly to the guys that may be watching this, it's a lot harder for guys in general, and it's a sexist remark, for guys to reach out to friends to continue to have that strong social connection. You have to be deliberate about it. A little bit easier for women. They tend to be very much more social and be able to kind of maintain those connections as you go through life, but an important component of it. And finally, the last component is spirituality. Now, spirituality is interesting because this is not something that I used to ask my patients about when I first started my practice. I now ask every single patient about their spiritual health. And spirituality doesn't have to be an organized religion. It's as much about how you think about your purpose in life and how you fit into the world, right? So people with a strong spiritual practice have an anchor, whether it's some form of a deity that you believe in, but it can be something as simple as sitting in nature, contemplating who you are and where you are in your life. Studies that have been done, people with strong spiritual practices live longer, live healthier. Those are just the results. So this is a lot, right? This is one component of those 4 pillars that I talked about. So how do we put it all together, right? So I'll give you my example. So I have a mental resiliency practice that I do on a daily basis. I started meditating a couple of years ago. Now I try and do it every day. So how do I do it? So I typically drive my son to school in the morning. My wife and I trade off, and because we have to drive about an hour to get him there. So what I do is I'll either wake up a little bit early, or I'll take a few minutes in the morning that I'll wake up. I'm Catholic, so I'll do the daily readings, whatever the readings are for the day, or I'll listen to them on a podcast, and then I'll think about them for a few minutes, and I'll meditate. I can meditate on the particular readings, or I can just do a guided meditation using many of the different apps that are out there, Calm and Headspace and Insight Timer. These are all really good apps that are out there that do cost a little bit of money. Insight Timer, I believe, is free, but it will help you kind of go through a guided meditation process. So that takes about 10 minutes in my morning. So it's not like I'm spending hours and hours doing it, but I'm taking those 10, maybe 15 minutes for me to kind of set my intention for the day. Now, you can do that through meditation. You can do that through breath work. You can do that through a gratitude practice of journaling. There's many different ways that you can do it. So what I'd like to do is teach you one specific technique, and it's around breathing. And it's called the 4-7-8 breathing exercise. This is popularized by Dr. Andrew Weil, who's considered the father of holistic medicine. But the technique itself has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, coming from the Eastern rites, from India and from the Far East. Breath work is one of those mindfulness practices. So breath work can be done, and there's many, many different types of breath work. I'd encourage you to check out a gentleman by the name of Wim Hof, Wimhof. He is a legend. He is considered, he's written a bunch of books, but he's most popularly, famously known as the Iceman. He's packed himself in ice and had for 2 hours and not had developed hypothermia. He kept his core body temperature up. He uses a particular breathing technique that's actually been studied, and he's taught other people how to do that, to be able to both calm himself, increase his heart rate variability, improve immune function, like some of the studies that have been done have actually looked at immune system modulation through breath work, which is just fascinating. So check him out. Wim Hof is a great YouTube video out there. So the other, this 4-7-8 breathing exercise is something very simple that can be done. So 4 references breathing in. So you breathe in, take a deep inhalation for 4 seconds, hold it for 7 seconds, and then let it out kind of in a forced exhalation for 8 seconds. And what you're trying to do is really modulate that vagal nerve, that parasympathetic activity, to be able to kind of achieve the kind of calmness that you need to achieve. So I'm going to demonstrate it. So I'm going to count on my fingers since I can't count while I'm breathing. So 4, 7, 8, right? Just take a couple of normal breaths. And you would repeat that cycle several times. So 4, 7, 8, for those of you that think that this is all really interesting but a little bit out there for me, they teach this, it's called box breathing, to our special forces. So if they're teaching it to our special forces, there's probably a pretty good reason for them doing that. I'd like you to kind of stop the recording at this point, or stop the video, and maybe try that 4, 7, 8. Usually what I would recommend is a couple cycles, seated in a chair, comfortable with your back straight. You can lie down when you do it. You have to close your eyes and just try it. It's a great activity for people that are having trouble sleeping. And there's a lot of people with insomnia, or people that are just having a little bit of anxiety. Doing 3 or 4 cycles of this, very good for lowering your heart rate, lowering your blood pressure, calming yourself. Can do it as an intention in the morning, can do it at night. If you have trouble and wake up in the middle of the night, certainly something that you can practice. So I encourage you to do so. So let's talk a little bit about something really interesting. The largest life-limiting health issues we face. In other words, also known as what's likely to kill you. So if you've made it into your mid-50s, and, unless you've had some tragedy, either a serious illness or an accident or an early cancer that kind of takes you out early in life, there's only 3 common pathways the majority of us will find ourselves in leaving this world. And it really revolves around these 3 areas. It's around cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular meaning both the heart and the brain, the cardio and the vascular part of that. Cancer, and neurodegenerative diseases. Those are the 3 final common pathways, neurodegenerative being dementia, Parkinson's, other kind of cognitive issues that will cause and lead to our death. And the issue isn't that we're not going to get one of these. The issue is how long we can delay getting one of these before it needs to be treated. It's much different to get cardiovascular disease in your 70s versus in your 40s and 50s, right? Similarly for all of those other ones. And that's really what Healthspan is all about. It's not that we can prevent all of this. We all die of something. But how do we prevent as long as possible, really the presentation of those diseases, so that when we start our treatment, we start much later in life as opposed to much earlier in life. So just to put a finer point on this, 2 out of every 5 women and 1 out of every 2 men will get cancer in their lifetime. That's a shocking statistic, right? That's from the National Cancer Institute. Now, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to die of cancer. We know a lot of people that are now living many, many years after a cancer diagnosis, depending on when it was diagnosed. But if you talk to oncologists, and these are studies that have been published, the belief is that upwards of over maybe 50% of all cancers can be prevented. Hear what I said, not treated, prevented. So if we can prevent 1 out of 2 cancers from ever happening to someone, wouldn't we want to do that? Just to put a finer point on this statistic, my first wife of 17 years was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer at just about 40 years of age, and she died at 41. So no history, no symptoms, and it was just one of those things. And that's just goes to show you that if we can prevent, half of those cancers, and the things we're talking about right today, if you do them, you will achieve that goal of preventing 50% of the cancer you may or may not have had. And I would encourage you to do so. We also know that there's this rise in chronic disease, right? And we've seen this over the last 30 to 40 years. It's been well documented through the National Institute of Health, through all of their statistics. The reality is 6 in 10 adults in the United States have one chronic condition as defined by one of those blocks below: heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, or chronic kidney disease. And 4 in 10 adults, 4 in 10, 2 out of every 5, has 4 or more, has 2 or more of those chronic diseases. And it really breaks into those 3 buckets that I talked about: heart disease and stroke, cancer, and neurodegenerative diseases. There's a couple other ones that are up there, but they account for the vast majority of it. So that's really a shocking statistic. So the question is why? Why are we seeing this rise of chronic disease? So here's one graph. You got to be number 1 in something. So that's the United States. At the top of that graph, it's the same data from the OECD, looking at all of the countries that we always look at. So we're number 1. Over 40% of our adult population is considered obese. That's certainly leading to some of the rise of chronic disease that we'll talk about. We'll talk about the importance of obesity actually in a few slides about cancer and how it impacts different things. But I call your attention, and I know it's very difficult to see unless you really enlarge the slide, is toward the bottom, the third from the bottom, at 9.8% obesity rates in Italy. Well, Italy's the land of pizza and pasta, right? Isn't that, what Italians eat? Well, of course it's not, right? That's what the Americans eat when they go to Italy. So Italy and that region is famous for one particular nutritional regimen. And many of you have heard about it. It's been the most studied diet. It's really lifestyle as well in the entire history of studying nutritional regimens, and that is the Mediterranean diet. Exactly. Mediterranean diet really focused on fresh vegetables, a little bit of fruit, healthy proteins. Their primary protein is fish just because they live around the sea, but they do eat animal proteins as well, but really focused on fresh fruits, vegetables, olive oil. They do have the glass of red wine in the evening hours. And if you follow a strict Mediterranean diet, you'll see a 40% reduction in your risk of heart disease. There's some staggering statistics out there. And what I really want you to understand is that a lot of this is in your control, right? It's in your control. And that's the common theme that you're hearing here. So what else may be accounting for this rise in chronic disease? Well, This is an interesting graph that I found. It looks at total food production normalized on a per person basis. And those numbers you see are calories per day that are consumed. The inner ring is from 1970. The outer ring is 2014. The first thing I would call your attention to is the inner ring. If you totaled up all of those numbers, per calories per day on average that an individual in the United States would eat, it's just under 2,000. Okay, you total up that outer ring, almost 2,400 calories. So in the span of less than 50 years, we've increased our calorie count by 20%. Staggering number. 20% more calories that we're ingesting. And you hear this argument that, you know, it's all about calories in, calories out, how much you exercise, how much you eat. It's called the thermogenic argument. And we've heard that from our doctors, right? Oh, you need to eat less, you need to exercise more, right? And there is some truth to that because we are eating in general more calories than we have in our history. And our body doesn't quite know what to do with that. Actually, our body knows exactly what to do with that, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides, because genetically we're programmed to do a certain thing. But let's look at the different areas here. So the biggest area is increases in oils, right? You see that shaded gray area. What are the three main commodity crops that are grown in the United States? I'll give you a second to think about that. Three main commodity crops. They are, shout them out, grains, wheat, right? Soy, right? Soybeans. And what's the third? Corn, right? Those are the three main commodity crops. Corn, high fructose corn syrup, and feed for animals, which is what the majority of the field corn goes to. Soybeans, but mostly oils, vegetable oils. And the third one is wheat for refined grains, right? And farmers, through no fault of their own, that farm these are commercially trying to farm these because they're trying to make a living. And they actually can get crop insurance on these main commodity crops because the belief was 30, 40, 50 years ago, we weren't going to have enough food to be able to feed the world and certainly feed our country. Well, we've become very good at growing food in the United States through many, many advances in agriculture. Some of them, you know, you can question whether they may be impacting our long-term health. But a vegetable farmer can't get crop insurance on his vegetables. He can get it on his wheat that he's growing on a commodity basis, but not necessarily on his vegetables. And food scientists, now that we have an abundance of wheat, soybean, and corn, through no fault of their own, they're not evil people, they're just trying to sell you another bag of chips. So they're going to figure out how to take these products and process them and make them into something that you really, really want to enjoy. So if you want to Google something, Google the bliss point in food, BLISS. It's that point in sweetness, savoriness, sugar, and salt that your body kind of craves that makes you want to eat more of that. And that's what a lot of these ultra-processed foods are designed to do, is to have you eat more of it because they want to sell more of it. So just realize that. Look, I think we've peaked as far as sugar consumption is concerned. It's starting to go down. Animal proteins have stayed a little bit flat. Certainly, there has definitely been an increase in oils and vegetable oils. There's no question about that. And those are things, and refined grains. And those are things that could be possibly contributing to chronic disease. So just think about that as we go on. So there's other things in your environment that we think about. And normally we think about toxins in our environment. When you think about environmental things that may negatively impact us, we think of chemicals, right? There's 80,000 chemicals produced every year in the United States. The vast majority of them have not been tested on humans for safety. And there's about 1,000 new chemicals per year that are being introduced into our environment through various types of manufacturing processes, food processes. That's what most of us think about as like toxins in the environment, right? But let's think a little bit more about that. I mean, there's certainly things like heavy metals, like mercury and lead, and we've all heard and seen, contamination of municipal waters, whether it's Flint, Michigan, or other places across the country because of lead pipes. Certainly, that's an area that is of concern, and I actually do test my patients for heavy metals because it's actually one of the things that can cause chronic disease. You also think about simple thing like plastics and plastic water bottles. I would encourage you to get rid of all your plastic water bottles. Not only are they not good for the environment, but while most bottles are now BPA-free, bisphenol alanine, bisphenol A. Now there's bisphenol F. There's other bisphenols now that are out there that actually can leach into the liquid, especially on hot days. So I would really avoid you having plastic water bottles. I usually carry a stainless steel container with me. Some people carry glass with them, fine, but avoid the plastic water bottles. And finally, let's think about personal care products, the things we put on our children. There's a great website called the Environmental Working Group, EWG.org, where you can actually evaluate sunscreens. Simple thing, right? Because there are certain chemicals in sunscreens that many things get absorbed into our body if we put them on, whether it's a personal care product or sunscreen. And some of those are not necessarily the best things to be absorbing into your body. So think about that as toxins in our environment and what we can do. There's a lot of controversy about Roundup, which is the glyphosate, which is the largest herbicide produced in the world. Tons and tons of it is produced, both in the United States and worldwide. And there's a question of whether it can cause chronic health issues. The science is controversial, and I readily admit it, but it is something that we should actually think about as we're looking at kind of the food we eat and how we should stay as healthy as possible. There's other environmental things that you want to think about. This is an example from the Great Salt Lake. Great Salt Lake is now a third of its size that it was at times in history, 1/3 its size. And one of the concerns that people are now seeing is all this exposed dry lake bed in the Salt Lake City area. There's a lot of trailings from the mines because there's a lot of mines in the mountains around Salt Lake that they were just kind of extracting minerals and other precious metals from the mountains that were usually covered by water. Now that the lake bed is exposed, a lot of that is being aerosolized, and there's a question of if the Salt Lake completely dries up, which is a real concern, that all of those toxins will be released. Not good for the skiing in Park City, but also not good for the people in Salt Lake City and that surrounding area. So when we talk about environmental toxins, these are the things that I kind of want you to understand is like avoid plastic containers. Certainly never microwave anything that's plastic. That's the worst thing that you can do. Buy glass containers, simple thing that you can do. If you're getting takeout Chinese, please don't microwave it in the box. It's got that plastic lining. Even those BPA frees, they have plastic linings that can get into the food. Buy organic whenever possible. There's the Dirty Dozen and Clean 15. Also on the Environmental Working Group, probably what they're most famous for, EWG.org. Check it out. Dirty Dozen are the most heavily pesticide-laden fruits and vegetables that you really want to try and buy organically. And the Clean 15 are the ones that, yes, they're conventionally raised, that is probably okay for you. Avoid nonstick cookware. It's not only Teflon, it's anything that's nonstick. Stay away from that. Air fresheners, interesting, like those Glade plugins that we all hear about. They release a substance called limonene. Limonene, when it's aerosolized, it's part of the smell, combines with ozone that's all around us in small amounts and actually forms formaldehyde in the air. Probably not something you want to be inhaling on a regular basis. So those plugins are probably something you want. Now, essential oils and diffusers of essential oils, perfectly fine, but avoid those electronic plugins. Keep electronics away from private parts. avoid regular use of pesticides. I know people in the South, very common to have bug issues. You want to try and minimize that because they can be neurotoxic, not only to the bugs, but also long-term to the people. And one of the traditions of Eastern regions, as we saw with masks many years ago, that we kind of looked askance at people wearing masks during flu season. Well, maybe that was probably a good idea to do. Taking your shoes off at the door because of tracking in different chemicals that may be in the environment or outside, probably not a bad idea. And check out personal care products and sunscreens at ewg.org as well. So let's talk a little bit about the second component, which is nutrition, right? Nutrition, movement, sleep, and mental resiliency. So this is how I like to talk about nutrition. Nutrition to me and movement are kind of like 1 and 2, 2 and 1, depending on how you kind of look at some of the data. My feeling is there is nothing that will affect your long-term health more than the 2,000 to 2,500 calories that you put in your mouth every single day. That's about 3 or 4 pounds of food. Those choices that you make for those 3 or 4 pounds of food, those 2,000 calories, will affect your health more than anything else on a daily basis. So there was this really smart doctor called Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine. And he was famous. He lived 25 centuries ago, before CAT scans, before lab testing, before PCR testing, before vaccine usage. Really smart guy. He said food should be our medicine and medicine should be our food. And he's famous for another quote that is, all diseases begin in the gut. Hippocrates, pretty smart guy. So he didn't have all those advanced testings, ways to do it, but he just observed people around him. Who was doing well? Who wasn't doing well? Why? And he found out a lot just by doing that. So this is what we consider kind of the recommendation from our government, the USDA and Health and Human Services. It changes every 5 years. It's pretty much the same as it is now. And everyone remembers what it used to be. What did the recommendation used to be? What shape? Yeah, it was a pyramid, right? Yeah. And what was at the bottom of the pyramid? Do you remember that? Grains. 6 to 11 servings per day of grains. Wow. That's a lot of grains, right? You know, people say that we don't listen to our government. Actually, I think we do listen to our government. And when there was this whole belief way back when that it was all about the fat content, right? A doctor named Ansel Keys convinced the government 70 years ago that the driver of long-term health issues was really increasing fat intake. And he saw that, and he did some studies that was actually over a couple different countries. And he convinced the government that it was all about the fat, right? We had to get our fat content down. So let's think about that for a minute. There's only 3 main macronutrients that we eat, types of energy sources, right? There are carbohydrates, which become sugar in our body, glucose. There is protein, which become amino acids. And there's fat, which becomes ketones as an energy source. So carbohydrates, protein, and fat, right? Those are the 3 things we can eat, right? So if Dr. Keys was successful in saying, hey, we need to eat less fat. Okay, there's only 2 other things that we can eat if we're eating less fat. One is carbohydrates, and remember about the commodity crops, right? And the other is protein. Protein intake is hard to increase. We are increasing it. It's usually through animal proteins, which is a little bit harder to from a cost standpoint. The easiest thing is carbohydrates, right? So what did we do? We cranked up our carbohydrates, 6 to 11 servings of grain a day, maybe contributing to some of the issues we're seeing today. So now this is the recommendation. 50% of your plate should be fruits and vegetables, more vegetables than fruit. Those fruits should be varied in color. There's many hundreds, if not thousands, of phytochemicals that we're discovering in different colors. So the saying is, eat the rainbow. eat as varied a color of different fruits and vegetables as you can. And again, more vegetables than fruit. I tell my patients, and I practice, 75% of your plate should be plants, should be leaning toward vegetables. A quarter of your plate should be healthy proteins and fats, and a quarter of your protein complex grains. Okay, things like whole wheat bread, brown or black rice, whole wheat pasta. So not simple things like white rice, refined grain pastas, chips, all the other things that we normally will eat. It's interesting. I did a kind of a self-experiment on myself. I'm kind of big on that. And I wore a continuous glucose monitor, one of those little devices you see some people wearing behind their arm. I'm not diabetic, but I wanted to see kind of how my blood sugar responded. And I found that my blood sugar had its biggest spike when I ate a bowl of steel-cut oats that I had to cook, not the instant, with some blueberries on top of it. My blood sugar went from under 100 to over 200 and stayed there for a couple of hours. Now, I always thought that I was kind of carb sensitive, and that was just kind of the information, the actual information that I am in fact carb sensitive. So I try and keep my carb content down a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides, why that becomes important. Not saying carbs are bad. Please don't misunderstand me, but for me, in particular, I am carb sensitive. So let's talk a little bit about metabolic health. And what does nutrition have to do with the big three? Heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases. And actually, it's a lot. And it's this whole concept called insulin resistance. Okay, so this is a little bit of a complicated subject to explain. So I'm going to show you kind of a graphical presentation of it in a minute. But let's talk a little bit about insulin. Insulin's a hormone, does a lot of things in your body. But the two things that we'll focus on are, one, insulin is released by your pancreas, which sits behind your stomach, in response to a meal. Typically carbohydrate, but in response to most meals. Why is that? Because insulin tells your body to move sugar from your bloodstream to one of two areas. Your muscles, which is the primary place that it goes to be utilized, and your liver, so it can be stored as energy. So that's what one thing insulin does. Tells your body to move blood sugar from the bloodstream, because you don't like a high blood sugar or a low blood sugar for that matter. Move it out, goes into muscles to be taken up and utilized as energy, and also tells your liver to start storing energy. The second thing that insulin does, for the purpose of our discussion, is it tells your liver to stop breaking down fat. The higher your insulin level, the less likely you are to be able to break down fat. And that's a really important concept that not a lot of people know about insulin. So why is that? Well, let's think about from a ancestral basis, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago, genetically, how are we built? We were always in periods of feast and famine, right? We always had those competing two things. We had a lot of food, we had a little food, and there was a lot more famines than there were feasts, right? Way back when. It's only very recently that we don't have an issue, most of us, in that regard. So your body is designed to store energy. And how does it store energy? It stores energy as fat, as lipoproteins, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So insulin is excreted, tells your body move blood sugar into the muscles, tells your liver to store energy, tells your liver stop breaking down fat. If your insulin level is high, you will not be able to utilize that stored energy, that fat that you have, regardless of how much you work out, regardless of all that stuff that you do. You can work out till the cows come home. If your insulin level is high, you will not be able to break down that fat. That's just a reality. I actually check fasting insulin levels on my patients. I have a young lady who has a fasting insulin level of 75. Normal, I like to see it under 10. They say normal is up to 20. I like to definitely see it under 10, but 75, certainly. And obviously, as you can imagine, she has a weight issue. So my job is to figure out how we can drop that insulin level. So that's an important concept for everyone to understand. So let's look at this kind of graphically. So the pancreas, which is in the center of the picture, or center of the graphic rather, secretes insulin. Or sugar is taken up by the muscles, and it's a signal to the liver to store energy. How does your liver store energy? Well, we know it eventually becomes fat, but it stores energy as lipoproteins. Lipoproteins, we all know what they are, or most of us know what they are, because that's what our doctor measures during a cholesterol test. Total cholesterol, HDL is a lipoprotein, LDL is a lipoprotein, triglycerides. These are all storage forms of energy that your body packages and sends out into the bloodstream to be stored in long-term storage in your fat cells, which is the kind of yellow with the red stripe on the left. But as it goes through your bloodstream, as you can know from that little donut just above my head, is that sometimes those lipoproteins kind of bang into the top layer of cells of the blood vessel lining, and it gets underneath them. And then it causes an inflammatory reaction. So think of this as your artery around your heart, one of your coronary arteries. That's plaque formation. Do you know when that process starts? So they did autopsies on Korean War veterans, guys in their 20s, and they saw plaque formation 20 years old. There's actually evidence that it may actually start before that. So that heart attack that someone has in their 50s is probably a process that has been going on for 20 to 30 years. And in addition to that, that plaque formation is not because of high cholesterol. It's because of inflammation. It's the inflammatory reaction of that lipoprotein getting underneath that top layer of cells, and your immune system being activated, and your white blood cells and your platelets and all that, forming that layer of plaque is part of inflammation in your body. Cardiovascular disease is an inflammatory disease. It's not a disease of LDL. And that's something that's been known for decades. But everyone focuses on the LDL, right? But it's really about the inflammation. Simple way to measure it is through something called a CRP, a C-reactive protein. Now, while a high CRP, which is bad, doesn't tell you exactly where the inflammation is, it tells you that you're in a high inflammatory state and that you're more likely to be developing plaque and other issues, whether it's around your heart, around your brain, kidneys, all these places where over years and years and years you can have problems. So eventually that gets to the long-term storage on the left side, which are the adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat, right? With some blood vessels running through it. We used to think about adipose tissue as kind of just inert, inactive. Yeah, it's just fat, right? We know now that adipose tissue, fat, is a metabolically active organ. The more fat that you have, specifically visceral fat around your organs like your liver and your kidneys and your heart, the more cytokines that you release. And everyone knows what cytokines are, right? Because we've heard about it through the cytokine storm, specifically in COVID. Things like tumor necrosis factor, interleukin-10, and there's a bunch of other ones. These are inflammatory mediators that fat produces. The more fat you have, the more inflammatory mediators you produce, the more plaque formation you will get. So it's this kind of vicious cycle of both increase in the lipoproteins, increased inflammation, increased fat formation. So the key is, how do we drop our insulin level down to a level where our body can start mobilizing that fat to be used as energy? And I think I mentioned before that I wore that continuous glucose monitor. While I'm a relatively trim guy, you can't see my whole body. I know that my sensitivity to carbohydrates is not unique. About 50% of people over 65 years of age in the United States are pre-diabetic, and 25% have diabetes. So 75% of people over age 65 are diabetic or pre-diabetic in the United States, and I think other countries, unfortunately, are catching up with us. So to me, my real message is it's not about the fat. It's about refined carbs and processed foods that you really need to minimize so you can drop that insulin level down, so your body can start actually utilizing those stored energy that you have for its energy source, as opposed to putting on more fat. Difficult concept, I know, so you may want to listen to it again. All right, so what do we want to avoid? We want to avoid what's called the standard American diet. The appropriate acronym for that is SAD. And this is a bit dated slide, but I think most of the information is correct, or unfortunately has gotten worse. 70% of all food produced in the United States is considered processed foods. Actually, the term now they're using is ultra processed. That's anything that usually comes in a bag or a box. Think about the things that we produce, right? All the snack foods that we produce, but even a lot of the meals that we produce, pre-prepared meals that are already cooked and put in a box. High sugar content, high salt content, in some cases, high fat content. 70% of everything that we consume as Americans are processed or ultra processed. Huge number. 10% of disposable income is spent on fast food. Shocking statistic. Americans ingest 130 pounds per person per year of sugar. Think about that. 130 pounds per person per year. Wow. If you add to that refined grains, which turn into sugar in your body, right? Your body breaks it down to glucose and uses it essentially as it's like you're eating more sugar. About an equal amount of refined grains. So almost 3/4 of a pound of food per day is either sugar or refined grains out of that 3 to 4 pounds of food that you eat. Your body was never designed, our bodies were never designed to be able to metabolize that level of sugar and refined grains. Just wasn't. 100 years ago, it was a fraction of that. And why? And how did we get it? We got it through fruit, right? That was how we got our sweetness. But now it's in just about everything. So more than, unfortunately, that statistic is dated. It's now 40% of Americans are obese. And unfortunately, over 20% of children are now considered obese. And that number continues to climb, which is a very sad statistic. In the early 2000s, you may remember this, they were putting soda machines in elementary and high schools, of course looking for revenue sources, as our schools always do. And that probably wasn't the best thing to do. Now most of them have been removed. And everyone remembers Michael Bloomberg when he was mayor of New York, tried to institute a sugar tax, right? Because he knew things were unhealthy, and everyone, or not everyone, but a significant people rose up because they had a God-given right to a 64-ounce big gulp. Well, if we had to imply and impute all the cost for that 64-ounce big gulp, as far as your health impact, it would probably be well over $5. And I don't think a lot of people would be drinking that. But unfortunately, we have a choice in this life. I want to touch on intermittent fasting. So fasting is a topic that is often misunderstood, but that is very talked about. And there are proponents on this on many different extremes, as is true of any of the stuff I talk about. Fasting is this concept of denying yourself food for a period of time. For what reason? Well, remember when we talked earlier that our body is always designed to store energy, right? So metabolically, if you look at your self from 30,000 feet, your body's doing one of two things. It's metabolizing food or it's repairing itself. Metabolizing food, repairing itself. Those are the two things, right? And remember what I also said is we will always, always, always prioritize metabolizing food because your body thinks there's going to be a famine, right? So what you want to do during fasting is give yourself a period of time where you can go without, so your body can turn its attention to repair processes at a cellular level. This is different than ketosis, which I'm not going to really talk about in detail. You have to be, in order to get in ketosis, it usually takes about 48 hours, and it's a different, it's certainly something that some people try, and that's fine. This is different than fasting. Fasting can be done in typical ways. They've studied what's called 5-2 fasting, where you eat normally for 5 days, calorie restrict for 2 days. You can do every other day fasting, which is normal amount of calories one day, calorie restrict the other day. So you kind of alternate. And then there's water fast, 1 day, 2 day, 3 day. There's all different kinds of ways to fast. What I encourage people to do is try and do 12-3 fasting. Very simple. 12-3 refers to the amount of time between last meal of the day and first meal of the day. Dinner to breakfast. When you break your fast, it should be 12 hours. Okay, so you have dinner at 7 o'clock at night. Don't eat till 7 o'clock in the morning. Usually not too hard for most of us. Some people like their midnight snack. Some people like to have a nightcap, which is clearly affecting you. And some people, like me, likes to have a Dove bar before I go to bed. I used to love Dove bars. I still do love them. And I used to have them like 3 or 4 days a week. Sadly, I do not have my Dove bars anymore. I think that it took me about 6 months to break that. But the only thing that I have after dinner most nights is some tea, some herbal tea. Nothing with calories in it, but you can have some herbal tea or some water. And that just gives your body a period of time to kind of turn its attention from, that metabolic focus on breaking down food to doing other things in your body. And the 3 refers to from the last meal of the day to when you go to bed should be 3 hours. Why is that? Well, it normally takes 4 to 5 hours for the food to get out of your stomach into the first part of your small intestine. So you want the majority of that metabolic activity, mechanical activity of your stomach kind of done when you go to bed. And so 3 hours, eat dinner at 7, go to bed at 10 or 11, usually not an issue. And every once in a while, if you have to be at a late dinner for whatever reason, that's okay. So 12-3 fasting. Part of some people extend that fasting, like I'll fast 3 or 4 days a week. I won't eat till about 10 o'clock in the morning some days. So I'm extending it a little bit. Most people believe that a large part of the fast, that 12-3 fasting benefit, is you're just narrowing the window in which you can eat. So you're basically able to consume less calories. I don't necessarily agree with this philosophy of 1 meal a day. There are some people that profess it as a health solution. I also don't believe in the 6 meals a day for reasons that we can talk about, or we could talk about at another time. You need to get a certain amount of specifically protein in certain amounts during the day so your body can actually use it for muscle building, which becomes very important, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So 12-3 fasting, very simple concept. Most people can do it. So nutrition, we've heard a lot about a lot. So what should you really take home? So first one is water should replace sugar. Anything you drink should be water. Tea, coffee is fine. A little bit of sugar is fine, but any sugar sweetened drinks, sweet tea, really big in the South, not really good for you. So try and minimize that as much as possible. Eliminate, and it's an extreme statement, minimize refined carbohydrates. Bread, pasta, rice, chips, granola bars. All the stuff that we love, try and minimize that as much as possible. Not good for you. Pack or make your own lunch. I used to work a lot of evenings and night shifts in the emergency department. And I would always bring in a big salad with me as part of my evening meal or dinner. And that was just my way of controlling my food environment, right? And I think most people, especially if you're working in an office, you're typically doing a lot of stuff, you're busy. If you have taken the time to bring your own food in, you're likely to be eating a lot healthier than if you just depend on what you can run out and grab or in one of the vending machines. Cook 1 meal per week. And this was something funny that I say in a lot of my lectures when I'm in front of somebody and they say, hey, we cook every night. Well, there's actually a lot of people that don't cook at all. So learn to cook some basic things so that you can do it healthier, because the evidence is clear. If you cook at home, the likelihood is it's going to be a lot healthier than if you went out. Carry healthy snacks for food emergencies. When I'm traveling, I have a container of like mixed nuts, beef sticks, carrots if I'm driving around local. So those are for my food emergencies, because I don't want to be stuck somewhere where I got to like buy a bag of something. I'd rather be able to travel with something. So if I do get hungry, at least I have it with me. And finally, if you do all of those things, then one thing any of us can do, including myself, is walk into your pantry, turn around, and there's probably something in there that you probably don't want in your house. There was a saying, I guess I've heard somebody mention in Weight Watchers, that deny yourself at the store once, say no once, so you don't have to say no 10 times when you get home. I thought that was pretty cool. It's very true. So don't bring it into the house if you don't have to. So something that we can all do. Okay, let's talk a little bit about movement. So which one are you? This is just a representation of really 3 big areas that I want to talk about. One is muscle mass and strength building, which is really important, especially as we age. The second one involves balance and flexibility, those 2 lower left and upper right, which become very important for injury prevention, both when we're young, but especially as we age. And the third is really aerobic capacity, which is really focused on long-term cardiovascular health and brain health, all of those things. All 3 of those components, it's really 4, but I kind of lump it into 3: strength building, balance and flexibility, and aerobic capacity are all really important. And we could talk a lot about each one of those areas. I'm going to touch on a couple that are really important. And the important thing I want to get across is a lot of what I'm going to talk about is a lot. So a lot of people are saying, this is just a lot of stuff. How can I possibly do this? So there's a simple thing I want you to keep in mind. If you go from not doing anything, if you're somebody that, look, I don't exercise. I know I need to exercise. I don't exercise. I don't move, which is more important than the exercise part. If you go from not doing anything to 30 minutes a day of moderate activity, which the best thing we can do is walk, right? You get 50% of the overall benefit of anybody that exercises, even those people that are triathletes and out there exercising 10, 15, 20 hours a week. Nothing to 30 minutes a day of walking will get you 50% of your total benefit from moving. So we'll come back to that statistic in a minute. So let's talk a little bit about muscles. I got some bad news for you. We lose our muscle mass as we age. We'll lose about 25% of it by the time we're 65 years of age. And we all see that. We see that in people as we're walking around, as we're aging. You can tell, he's gotten thinner and less muscular, he or she. It's just something that happens as we age. It's a reflection of lack of growth hormone that drops as we age, testosterone, both in men and women. And as importantly, it's a disuse issue, which means we're not using it, so we're losing it. And that's just reality. So the question is, what can we do about it? So this is a picture, and I know it's going to be kind of tough to see because usually it's projected on a big screen. A guy in his 40s, gentleman in his 60, 70-year-old. Both pretty healthy looking guy. Trim, fairly muscular. That little picture that you see on the right is a colorized MRI through your thigh, right? That little donut in the center is your femur, with the black being the bone marrow. The blue is muscle fibers. The green is connective tissue between the muscle fibers and your bones. And the red is subcutaneous fat, because we all have some fat that sits under our skin. It's normal. And you'll notice the difference between the guy that's in his 40s and the guy that's in his 70s, even though they're pretty good looking from a physical structure standpoint. A lot more connective tissue and a lot more fat as we age. Okay, so even if that's the case, can you change it? Well, this was a study that was done a long time ago. You know it was done a long time ago because it was done with pedometers. Looking at the same area through your thigh using an MRI. Dark gray is the muscle, the little donut that you see there. The black is actually bone and the white is bone marrow. And the rim of white is subcutaneous fat, adipose tissue fat. First one is a 24-year-old, second one is a 66-year-old, third one is a 66-year-old. So what's the big difference? Not the same person, but representative of what they found. The 66-year-old on the extreme right walked over 12,000 steps a day, and the person in the middle walked a little over 3,000 steps a day. Yeah. That's the difference. Just walking. Not a hard thing to do. They've done this kind of study in triathletes who obviously are on the extreme end of exercise, and you can actually get back to that first picture. And one of the first things I do, specifically I have to do this more with women because they're used to more high intensity activity, or they're doing a lot of yoga, Pilates, running, biking on a spin bike or whatever, but they're not used to building muscle. You need to build muscle, okay? Why? Well, what did we talk about before when we talked about insulin and where the sugar goes, right? One of the main places that the glucose goes, the sugar in your bloodstream, when insulin is released, is into your muscles. So if you don't have a lot of muscle or you lose muscle mass, you have more trouble controlling your blood sugar and you're more likely to develop insulin resistance. Okay, very important concept. So also want to introduce you to this concept called Zone 2 exercise. It's become much more talked about for people that do an intense amount of training. They'll be very familiar with it. If you're an athlete, as a coach, they'll talk about the different zones of activity. So what is Zone 2 exercise? So Zone 2 is one of 5 specific zones that you can kind of rate based on the amount of effort that you put out, right? If we're just doing some mild walking, we're in Zone 1. Zone 2, 3, 4, and 5 get progressively harder. The numbers you see on here, if you can see them, are based on the age, like what your zone should be. And there's a calculation that I'll tell you in a minute. There's a couple different ways to calculate it. So Zone 2 exercise is working to what's called the lactate threshold. It's working to the point where you can still utilize fat as part of your energy source. Once you get out of that, you pass what's called your lactate threshold. So how hard are you working in Zone 2? Not very hard. So in Zone 2, you can still carry on a conversation. So it would be like walking on a treadmill, on a stationary bike, low exertion. Because all of us think about exercise or movement as, I got to push it, right? I only got 20 minutes here, I got to do HIIT training. That's actually not the case. Zone 2 training does a lot of really interesting things, like increasing mitochondrial number and increasing mitochondrial function. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of your cells. As we age, we know that mitochondria decrease in number and decrease in function. So Zone 2 training actually builds up those mitochondria, improves insulin sensitivity, as we just talked about, and you increase your overall metabolic health. Metabolic health, think of it as the ability to use either fats or carbohydrates as your fuel source. sugar, or ketones, which are breakdown products of fat. Your body can use either one of them as a fuel source. Typically, most of us take in a lot more carbohydrates and can't break down as many fats, but your body can use them equally. So you want to be able to build that flexibility so your body can use either fats as part of energy or sugar. So exercising in zone 2 is to what's called the relative perceived effort. So what I talked about is exercising to the point where you can still carry on a conversation, but you're kind of getting to the edge of that. If you get to the point where you can't carry on a conversation, can't talk on the phone, can't talk to yourself if you're there alone, then you're out of zone 2. So people say, well, that's not intense enough for me. Well, it may not be intense enough for you, but those bikers that do the Tour de France, those professional cyclists, which some people think are the healthiest or the most fit people in sports, 70% of their training is in zone 2. 70. So the belief is that the majority of what we're doing, the kind of moderate low-level activity, should be the vast majority of what we're doing, especially when we're doing things like aerobically. Walking, running, swimming, biking, hiking. We should be spending the majority of our time in zone 2 for metabolic health. Now, how do you calculate this? All these numbers on here are using a calculation 220 minus age times 0.65. So it's 220 minus your age, you get a number, you times that by 0.65, and that's the range that you'll see there, the top and bottom numbers. There's other ways that you can do it. You can do what's called the Carbonin formula, which is a little bit more specific. It actually looks at your resting heart rate, and it takes into consideration what your heart rate reserve is. And there's calculators online that you can look up. It's actually, I think, a pretty good estimate of yours. You have to know your resting heart rate, which is pretty simple to measure. You can do a fit test if you're an athlete. You go to a place where they actually measure this. If you have a Garmin watch or one of these advanced sports watches, you can actually do it yourself. It'll give you some of the information on VO2 max and that kind of stuff, which we're not going to talk about. And finally, if you're really into this, you can actually measure your lactate at the end of a workout and poke your finger and make sure it's below a certain number. But that's just really for the die-hard people that got to know the number. The issue with zone 2 is that you need to do 45 minutes of solid work in zone 2. You can't kind of do in and out, in and out, in and out. You have to keep it at that level for 45 minutes. And my recommendation to you and to my patients, 45 minutes twice a week, zone 2. Figure out how to work it in. Now, people will say, well, what about high intensity? When can I do that? If you want, you can do 45 minutes of zone 2 and do 15 minutes of high intensity. That's perfectly fine. What you can't do is kind of pop in and out of it. You have to maintain that steady zone 2 for a solid 45 minutes. So pop in a good podcast, talk to somebody on the phone, do whatever you want. Find 45 minutes to work in some zone 2. So exercise, movement is really, as I said, walking definitely counts, and that's where I tell people to start. Start with walking. If you don't do activity, start with walking. The recommendation from the CDC, 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week. Walking will qualify. Most people talk about 150 to 300 minutes, and definitely work in some strength training as part of it. So this is my prescription that I give. Move every day for at least 30 minutes. So as you may have known, I have stopped this video several times because it's hard to sit in one place for as long as I have, and I'm walking around the house, so I'm following my own prescription. You can do walking, as I said. They did this really interesting study where they compared people that were primarily office-based workers and they looked sedentary workers. They weren't active or out. And they looked at, they took half of them and they worked them with a trainer 3 times a week for 45 minutes at a time. So they did that. And the other half of the group, they said, you know what? I want you to get up 6 times a day for 5 minutes and walk around. And they tested the normal stuff, baseline biometric assessment, weights, cholesterol level, fasting blood sugar, all the typical things that we do. And they did that for a period of time. They rechecked them. Who did better? People that got up and moved 6 times a day for 5 minutes at a time. That's your 30 minutes. So for those of us that are stuck in a cube or stuck in an office and endless meetings on Zoom, take a break. Take 5 minutes, walk around. Walk around your office, walk outside for lunch, do whatever you need to do. But figure out how to build in those breaks every day. Gardening, I love because it's a great activity. You can't see me normally when I'm giving the presentation. I bend down, I pull weeds, I do all the stuff that you do when you're gardening. Unfortunately, I can't do that. But gardening is great because it's a great core exercise. So 2 days per week is zone 2, minimum 45 minutes. Brisk walking, hiking, rowing if you're really good at it. Swimming if you're really good at it. Biking on a trainer is probably the best, unless you have a really flat road that you can keep a steady pace, which is hard. 2 days per week of strength training. 2 days per week, 30 minutes, full body stuff. Body weight, start with body weight. Squats, planks, push-ups. There's 7-minute workouts that you can do full body now that you can start with if you have not done weights. If you're of the means, I would suggest you go with a trainer and say this crazy integrative doctor says, I need to figure out how to work in strength training into my routine at least twice a week for 30 minutes. And they can teach you different things. The other thing that I recommend is, especially as we age, is make sure that you're doing one-legged exercises. So one-legged squats, again, I can't demonstrate it, or deadlifts. Really important for balance. Obviously, if you have trouble with balance, put your hand against the wall and just kind of go down and up on one leg. But that becomes very important because falls become an incredibly important component of injury, especially as we age, because our balances normally goes off. And there was an interesting study, I think, out of India that looked at older patients, older meaning over 60 years of age, but that's becoming younger and younger the year I get closer to it. Can you stand on one leg for 10 seconds? So let's try it. Everybody stand up. Come on. Stand up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. That's all you got to do. I was standing on one leg. If you could do that, your risk of dying in the next 10 years, if you can't do that, your risk of dying in the next 10 years is much higher than if you can. Very important. So make sure you're working on balance. And stretch. People don't think about stretching, especially as we age. I've been stretching literally for about the last 30 years. I get out of the shower in the morning, and I literally get on the ground after I dry off, and I do a couple simple stretches. Just making sure I'm limber. I have some chronic back issues, which thankfully have not given me problems in a long time. So just stretch for literally 2 or 3 minutes to keep yourself a little bit limber, keep those ligaments and those joints moving. So those are my prescriptions. All right, let's talk about sleep. So your brain is 2% of your body weight, and it accounts for 20% of all metabolic activity. So think about that. 2% of your body weight, 20% of all metabolic activity happens in your brain. And think about metabolic activity. What does that mean? Those are just biochemical reactions. Those biochemical reactions form byproducts. Some are toxic, that your body's continually detoxifying. That's just part of the normal process. But when does your body get rid of all those toxins? When you sleep, right? Your body does not have, or your brain does not have what's called a lymph system. Your lymph system runs kind of parallel to your venous system, to your veins. It takes toxins and brings them back and dumps them into one of the major arteries, major veins for processing in your liver. Your brain doesn't have a lymph system. What it does have is something called a lymphatic system. So when you sleep, and there's actually a really cool video of this, and they've documented this, your brain cells actually kind of shrink a little bit, and the space in between your brain cells gets bigger. That intracellular space, because it's fluid. It allows this kind of washing out of toxins, amyloid, which is really important because that's one of the things that kind of happens for people with dementia. They accumulate amyloid and other things. People that don't sleep properly don't have as much time to be able to have that detoxification process happen. So very, very important. So let's talk a little bit about sleep. Sleep's one of the most common problems that I see. About 40%, let's raise our hands, who has sleep issues, right? About 40% of people have some type of sleep disruption, and that's very common in my practice. So this is your normal sleep cycle. There's different scales that they can look at, but this one is a 5-stage of sleep. Stage 1 and 2 are light sleep, where you're still moving around a little bit. Stage 3 and 4 are deep sleep, and we'll talk about the importance of these. And stage 5 is REM sleep. It's actually not stage 1, as you can see in the graph. It's actually a separate sleep stage. So you'll notice you go through this cycle normally, kind of throughout the night, right? Normally it's 90-minute cycles through stage 1 through 3, 4 in REM, 1, 2, 3, 4 REM. And the other thing you'll notice, in the beginning of the night, more deep sleep. At the end of the night, more REM sleep, right? So, and that's a typical pattern that we will see. So let's look at, that was idealized, as you saw. This is like off a Fitbit tracker, although there's lots of different kinds of trackers. As you can see, the lower parts of that graph, deep sleep. The upper parts in the light blue are REM sleep. And then you have these spikes where you wake up. There's a great book by Dr. Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep. For those of you that are interested, I'm sure he's got a YouTube or podcast or whatever out there too as well. A TED Talk, I think. That really is fascinating about all the science behind sleep, getting what it does for your body and all the importance of all the different stages. Really worth reading. It definitely changed my mind on sleep. The important things that we want to focus on are deep sleep and REM sleep. Good balance, and again, it's idealized. 20% REM, 20% deep sleep. So the majority of your time is actually spent in light sleep. So what happens during these different stages? So the majority of the time, as I said, light, deep sleep. Memories are consolidated. So all of these different pieces of information that you have during deep sleep start kind of getting filtered because you can't keep them all the stimulation from the day, the light, the hearing, the taste, the tactile sensations, the smells, all the senses. You have to determine, like, what do I keep, what do I get rid of? Cellular repair, very important thing that happens in deep sleep. That's when your body goes into repair mode, and we talked about that with the fasting. Immune system activation. Really interesting study. It was referenced in the book. They gave these test subjects a vaccine. This was before COVID. It was a standard vaccine. I forget which one. And that was given. And for half of them, they short slept them. So they only gave them 4 hours of sleep. And they saw that for those that got 4 hours of sleep, and they measured immune system markers 24 to 48 hours later, they saw 40% less immune system activation for those that got one night of short sleeping. So especially around the time of COVID, but just in general for any of our health and wellness, you want to make sure your immune system is ready to defend you and all that you need to defend. REM sleep. So a couple things, memory connected, all these abstract concepts that we're trying to piece together, higher level thinking, emotional processing definitely happens during REM sleep, an important component of it, and also brain development. For young kids, spend a lot of time in REM sleep. Most young animals spend a lot of time in REM sleep because that's when your brain is developing all of those intracellular connections. Really important. So what happens if we don't sleep? Well, bad things, not surprisingly. We know that there's higher levels of depression rates in people that have trouble sleeping. We know that there's increased rates of breast cancer as well as hormone-sensitive cancers, breast, ovarian, prostate, for people that have trouble sleeping. And why is that? Well, we think that it's related to melatonin. Melatonin is one of those chemical or hormones that's really important, that does a lot of things, including modulate your immune system. And we know people that have poor sleep can actually have fluctuations or issues with appropriate release of melatonin, and we think that is linked to how cancer cells can develop. So things like cardiovascular diseases, weight gain, diabetes, anxiety levels, Dementia. Dementia, kind of like depression in a sense, it's kind of a chicken and an egg, right? We know people that have dementia, have trouble sleeping, right? Sleep disruption is very, very common. We also know that people that don't sleep well can get higher risks for dementia. So something you really want to pay attention to. Bottom line is get 8 hours of sleep. So while you won't be asleep for 8 hours, you should be in bed for 8 hours, right? 7 to 8 hours of sleep is the goal. And we'll talk about how to do that, because I know a lot of people say, but I have trouble sleeping. I just can't get to bed before 2 o'clock in the morning. And that is all true, but we'll talk about it a little bit. Sleep trackers, fitness trackers, lots of different devices, right? All of these are imperfect. They're not 100%. If you really think you may have a sleep issue, that there are medical reasons for sleep issues, like sleep apnea, certainly the most common, restless leg syndrome, also a condition that affects people's sleep. But these are good devices if you're into biometric tracking and you want to kind of see how you're doing. I think the Oura Ring, which is something I wear all the time, and as I said, it's up on my charger, is something that's been developed primarily as a sleep tracker, has now become a fitness tracker as well. But there's Garmin's, there's Apple Watches, there are, Fitbits, there are devices you can put under your bed. There's a myriad of different ones. I think they're all okay directionally. I do like the Oura Ring as far as giving you the different sleep stages, although other devices will do that as well. So what if you're having trouble sleeping? Like, how should we think about this? Well, I think about it in these three ways. I think about it as minimizing sleep disruptors, what I call the glide path to sleep, and the environment in which we sleep. So sleep disruptors, right? If you're having trouble sleeping, I want you to get sleep hygiene. This is all about sleep hygiene. So what are sleep disruptors? Well, the most common sleep disruptor, most people have it every day, caffeine. Caffeine has a half-life of 6 hours, which means that cup of coffee that you had at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, half of it is still in your system at 9 o'clock at night. And we know that there are people that are fast metabolizers and slow metabolizers of caffeine. You can test for it, but you probably already know. I am a slow metabolizer. If I have a cup of coffee after 1 or 2 o'clock, I will have trouble going to sleep. My wife, Amy, she can have a cup of coffee at 9 o'clock at night and go to bed just fine. She's a fast metabolizer. I tell people, if you're having trouble getting to sleep, no caffeine afternoon, maximum of 2 cups of coffee. And not like the ground ice Starbucks coffee, just like a regular cup of coffee. Other sleep disruptors, very common one, alcohol. Alcohol, while it will sedate you, because there is a sedative aspect of alcohol, once the alcohol is metabolized, it actually becomes excitatory and it disrupts your sleep architecture. And we kind of all know that. Anybody that goes out drinking or has one too many, then you kind of know the drill. If you are going to drink or have something with dinner, perhaps have 1 glass of wine or a cocktail. Don't have that nightcap. If you are having trouble sleeping, no alcohol 3 hours before bedtime. Allows you that time to fully metabolize it so it's out of your system. And one thing people don't think a lot about for sleep disruptors are exercise. Exercising late in the afternoon or evening hours. Exercise is great. It raises your heart rate, raises your blood pressure, raises your adrenaline and all those excitatory hormones in the short term. In the long term, it's all good for you. In the short term, does all those things. So you don't want to be doing it late at night. Try and do it in the certainly early afternoon, or better yet, in the morning hours if you can. Second part is what I call the glide path to sleep, just like a pilot landing a plane. You want to prepare for a good night's sleep. So things like, do you have a nighttime routine? Do you set an alarm to go to bed? Maybe like an hour before. One of the things that you want to think about. We all set alarms to wake up. Why not an alarm to remind us, hey, time to start gearing down? Light, bright lights. Bright lights suppress melatonin release. So recommendation is an hour to 2 hours before bedtime, start turning down lights. This is something that drives my wife crazy because I will go around the house, start turning down lights. But I'm just interested in her getting a good night's sleep. So you can allow that melatonin release. Obviously, the worst thing you can do is have blue light, which is something that we all have in our pocket or next to us, is that personal little computer that we're carrying around, that smartphone. So try and avoid that at least an hour before bedtime, especially for young people. Definitely a sleep disruptor, especially as their brains and their hormones are changing. Try and take that phone away an hour. It's an ongoing battle. I know, trust me. Nighttime routine, breath work, meditation. Maybe you're going to take a hot shower, maybe a little essential oils and a diffuser, maybe a little bit of chamomile tea or herbal tea to kind of relax you. All good stuff. So that glide path kind of preparing. So you have a routine for that. And finally, the environment in which we sleep. I tell people, and I'll tell you, your bed should be for one of two things. It should be for sleeping and sex. That's it. If you're used to having your computer in bed and doing work, while it's admirable, and as silly as this sounds, your brain will start associating your bed with work. So if you have to work, and there's times when we all have to do it away from your bed. Make that kind of your sanctuary so that when you get in bed, your brain and your body knows it's time to go to sleep or do that other thing. The other thing about the environment is it should be dark and cold. Kind of think about the cave, right? If you live in an area of light pollution, light blocking shades in your room, white noise is always a good thing, especially if you live in an area where there's a lot of noise in a city or something like that. Cold. What's the right temperature? The right temperature. Usually the cooler the better. Most studies show 67 to 68 is the right temperature to get to sleep. And then as the day goes on and the night goes on, especially toward the morning hours, you should have like a warm up. So just think about us being in the cave and the sun coming up. That should be it. And obviously that electronic device I talked about can be in any of those three areas. Can be a disruptor, can influence the glide path and certainly the environment. So don't be looking at screens while you're in bed. And try and charge that phone on the other side of the bed or on the other side of the room or preferably out of the room, which I know is hard for some people. So that's the environment in which we sleep. I sometimes ask people, okay, doc, I'm doing all these things. I've got good sleep hygiene. I'm minimizing disruptors. Glide path's good. Environment's good. What else can I do? What else can I take, right? Well, the one thing I don't want you taking is Ativan, Klonopin, Valiums, those benzodiazepines. While they will get you to sleep, you will become addicted to them. And long-term studies of people that have been on them show higher mortality rates for people that take them routinely to sleep. You die sooner. So it's probably something that you should try and get off. They're very addictive, and it's very hard to, but there are ways to get off. There are weaning protocols and that kind of stuff. Ambien, Lunesta, those sleep agents, also not a big fan of them. If you're jet lagged or you're traveling to the West Coast or you're doing something, coast to coast and you needed to sleep, fine. You travel a long distance, fine. That's perfectly fine. But having to use something routinely for that, probably not recommended. Recommend you see a sleep specialist. If you really have trouble, I've referred several patients to someone that does cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. Very good data that if you truly do have trouble sleeping, that's definitely one of the things that they go into a deep dive as to, what are you sleeping? How do you think about it? The whole process in great detail with some techniques and tools that you can use to get it. Very good success. Simple things that I recommend to some of my patients: magnesium. Magnesium, probably 70% of us don't get enough of it. Two versions of magnesium I recommend. It's a muscle relaxant, so it does help relax you. Magnesium glycinate, Glycinate, and magnesium L-threonate, L-threonate. The ones on the shelves are usually the cheaper, not the cheaper versions, but yeah, they are cheaper because they're easier to produce. But those two specifically I recommend for sleep. Magnesium L-threonate crosses the blood-brain barrier, so there's some benefits there for brain health. More expensive, but usually 200 milligrams to 400 milligrams. The rate-limiting step with magnesium, if you take enough of it, is you will get loose stools. Usually you really have to push the dose high, but 200 to 400 milligrams shouldn't cause a problem an hour before bedtime. Other things like valerian root, ancient herb, is something that I'd also recommend. Ashwagandha, which is an adaptogen for people that are really stressed. That can sometimes be helpful as well. So there's a lot of other different things that we can use to supplement it, but I would encourage you to first get these right and then think about those other things to add in. And certainly if you think you have a medical sleep issue, definitely have yourself checked out, because not all sleep apnea patients with sleep apnea don't always snore, because there are other forms of sleep apnea that you have that you don't necessarily snore. So, all right, we're getting to the end. Let's talk about the centenarians and the blue zones. So the centenarians were centenary study of the blue zones. A guy by the name of Dan Buettner, he National Geographic's reporter, now has made blue zones his life. And he found these areas in the world where people were living to over 100 than would be much more, in much higher percentage than would be expected. So places like Icaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, Loma Linda, California, Okinawa, Japan, somewhere in Costa Rica. I think those were the 5 main areas. And he kind of, just like any good reporter or scientist, kind of said, well, why? Why are these people living to 100 years of age at a much higher percentage than would be predicted? It was called a centenarian study. So he kind of took, and this is kind of representative of one of the particular areas that, or 3 of the particular areas he looked at. And he looked at this and said, okay, what are the commonalities? And this overlapping Venn diagram is basically what they are. So I'm going to read this a little bit. So one is family. Strong family connections. We've already talked about tribe and community. Non-smoking, no smoking, obviously. Plant-heavy diet, not plant-exclusive, but plant-heavy. Constant, moderate physical activity. So what was the most common physical activity they did? Did they go to Gold Gym 3 times a week? Gardening. Gardening was the most common thing that was common to these 3 particular areas. Obviously very geographically diverse, food-wise very diverse, social engagement, as we've already talked about with tribe, and legumes or beans. Another thing that was a great protein source, great fiber source, that was a commonality for that. So this stuff is not rocket science, right? Things I'm telling you, you probably have heard before. But the question is, how do you implement these 4 pillars in your life so that you can really have that longevity, the kind of health span that you want? So I would encourage you to kind of pick out an area. There's those 4 areas. Nutrition. What can I do differently in nutrition? How about movement? If I don't exercise, then maybe I need to start walking. If I do exercise a lot, maybe I need to build in some zone 2. Sleep. Am I getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep? And of course, mental resiliency, and those 4 components that we talked about in the beginning of our chat. So if you've gotten to the end, I want to say thank you. This is a long presentation, but I thought it's important for you to have it. That is my email address and website. I post a lot of stuff on a regular basis, either through blogs or through social media. So please feel free to connect with me on Instagram or Facebook, LinkedIn. And if you have any questions, feel free to email at afalcone@Dignity Integrative. And I hope you have a great day. I wish you good health, and take care, everyone. Bye.